Hello, my name is Krista Kubiak, and I'm here to talk about social cognitive theory, self-concept theory, and the theory of moral development. The objective for the day is to be able to identify the characteristics of the social cognitive theory, to be able to identify the characteristics of the self-concept theory, to be able to identify the characteristics of the theory of moral development, and to explain how each theory applies to learning and education. The social cognitive theory was theorized by Albert Bandura and is previously called the social learning theory. He believed that children learn through observation and that a child will behave in a way in which it believes it will earn approval. When a child receives positive reinforcement for their behavior, they will most likely continue that behavior. When a child receives negative reinforcement for a behavior, they will most likely change their behavior. Bandura believed that the reproduction of an observed behavior is influenced by the interaction of three factors: personal, which is the attitude towards the behavior; behavioral, which is the response received after the behavior; and environmental, which is the ability to actually complete the behavior. The social cognitive theory is guided by four mediational processes. The first one is attention, which is the extent we are exposed to and notice the behavior. Then follows retention, which is how well the behavior is remembered. Then we have reproduction, which is the ability to perform the behavior that has been modeled. And lastly, motivation, which is the will to perform the behavior. Before we move on to our next theory, let's take a minute and have a collaborative discussion. So think to yourself, as a teacher, how do you think the social cognitive theory applies to education in your classroom? And then share with a partner. Some of the ways that you could have spoken about applying the social cognitive theory to your classroom are listed on this slide. When we're speaking about attention, we could apply it to our classroom by thinking about using modeling, using high interest and culturally relevant material to engage students. In terms of retention, you could talk about continuous modeling, group practice, and the use of graphic organizers. In terms of reproduction, there is implementation of UDL, differentiated instruction, and classroom accommodations. And for motivation, we could talk about using praise, a positive behavior reward system, and background knowledge of students. And that's probably the most important. It's getting to know exactly who your students are and what motivates them to learn. Carl Rogers' self-concept theory is essentially about how someone thinks about, evaluates, or perceives themselves in terms of their personality traits, physical characteristics, their abilities, their values, their goals, their roles, and their overall knowledge of their own existence. The self-concept theory has three main components: self-image, which is how you perceive yourself; self-esteem, which is how much value you place on yourself; and the idea of your ideal self, which is how you wish you really were like. Carl Rogers theorized that the closer our self-image and ideal self are to each other, the more consistent or congruent we are, and the higher our sense of self-worth. Now I want you to take a moment and think about these two questions. As a teacher, how do you think the self-concept theory applies to education in your classroom? And if a student has a low self-concept, what can you do as a teacher to help raise it higher? We can apply the theory of self-concept to our own classrooms if we think about the fact the students have their own thoughts and perceptions about their academic skills. And they also tend to assess themselves by comparing themselves to their peers. And sometimes, students let those thoughts and perceptions guide their engagement, effort, and motivation towards learning. In order to raise the low self-concept of a student, you could do some of the following. Give them positive feedback, being encouraging, and not encouraging classroom comparisons among individual students, and opt for collaborative groups instead. Last, we are going to talk about the theory of moral development proposed by Lawrence Kohlberg. Now, in his theory of moral development, Kohlberg says that there are 6 stages of moral development divided into 3 levels. Pre-conventional, which is where children are only interested in their own benefit. Conventional, which is where children begin to learn about right and wrong in terms of rules. And post-conventional, where children learn about right and wrong in terms of morals. Here we have all 6 stages of Kohlberg's theory of moral development. School-age children tend to fall in one of the 3 levels that include conformity and interpersonal accord, authority and social order, and social contract. Take a moment to think about your students and which level they fall into. Keeping your students in mind, think about in what ways you could ensure moral development is occurring in your school or classroom. These are some of the things that you could have talked about that would help you ensure that moral development is occurring in your school or classroom. The first one is the implementation of effective classroom expectations, and this can be made further effective by making sure that your students play an active role in developing those classroom expectations. The second is collaborative grouping. The third is increasing opportunities for service projects. And the fourth is implementing a school-wide program of character education. Think of the 3 theories that we discussed today in this lesson. For an exit ticket, which of the 3 theories discussed in this lesson today do you think you could best apply